And he obviously didn't want to take a chance against Jon Jones. And after we saw what happened with Ciryl Gane, I don't blame him. I think the outcome would have been exactly the same.
Mockery, doubt, skepticism, ridicule. These are some of the things Francis Ngannou had to deal with from some parts of the MMA community starting on January 14th, 2023. Realistically, some of the doubts started after his fight with Ciryl Gane, where he made his intentions crystal clear that he was more than happy to sit out and let the sunset clause expire his contract. Is he going to resign? Where else is he going to go? Is he serious about having a boxing fight? The questions did not end there though. They continued, but even more relentlessly now. Week by week, as time passed, the doubt around Francis got larger and larger. The hate and mockery got worse and worse. Fumbled the bag became almost synonymous when talking about Francis. The community that at one time could not wait to see Francis fight. The community that saw him rise from the bottom to the top and through all the struggles. Part of that same community was now openly mocking him. Okay, just as a little side note, the fight between Fury and Ngannou hasn't happened yet as of recording this video. So, hopefully nobody gets injured and everyone can fight and get paid. Also, take a few seconds to like the video if you enjoy it. Enjoy the video. Francis Ngannou was not a Daniel Cormier type figure where he always had a pretty solid relationship with the UFC. If you guys remember, Francis and the UFC started butting heads all the way back in 2018. Do you guys remember 2018 when Stipe Miocic was champion? And at that time, Stipe was getting disrespected and felt disrespected by the UFC and Dana White. Boy, that felt like a totally different lifetime. Now, Francis himself theorizes that Dana started disliking him after Stipe dominated him for 5 rounds. And then shortly after that was the Derek Lewis versus Francis Ngannou fight, where Dana didn't exactly have nice things to say, obviously. I gotta say, in theory, blasting your fighters publicly probably doesn't exactly help, as Dana White himself is a very popular figure who gets a lot of viewership and eyes whenever he speaks. What's funny about all this is that he wasn't really mad with Derek Lewis, which was a little bit weird because Derek also contributed to a boring fight. And he actually cut Derek Lewis some slack because according to Dana, Derek puts on entertaining fights. Yeah, Francis Ngannou, definitely not an exciting and entertaining fighter by any means, right? Anyways, so you would think that a promoter would normally stop ripping a fighter after he does it right after the event, right? Nope. Dana White went right after Francis again the following month. This time mentioning that Francis has lost his mind and wonders if he'll ever get back on track. He also mentioned that he knew Stipe was going to win leading into their first fight because of the two having very different mindsets heading into the fight. When I was going back and researching all these articles again and these back and forths, I just couldn't help but wonder, maybe during this time period in 2018, if Dana White and Francis had a better relationship, is it possible that they would have had an easier time working out a deal and maybe Francis would still be in the UFC? Francis did go on to revive himself after the Derek Lewis fight. He beat Curtis Blades and Cain Velasquez in a very quick fashion back to back. Francis confirmed that he had not spoken to Dana White in about a year. The relationship was clearly in a poor spot. The promoter / president not talking to one of their relatively well-known fighters for a year? Pretty bad spot they were in. Dana White and Francis Ngannou's relationship, being the roller coaster that it is, took a turn for the better in the later part of 2019. In 2020, Francis Ngannou flatlines Rosenstrike. Great, things are looking up again. I remember really thinking that Francis was on the cusp of really becoming a star and was probably about to run through most heavyweights. Now, in order to get the full picture on Francis Ngannou, we also have to talk about one other fighter. Because as things were turning around for Francis, things took a turn for the worse for one other fighter. One other gentleman, Jon Jones. I won't talk too much about Jon Jones, but in order to understand everything that's related to Francis and from the history up until now, we do need to talk about Jon Jones a little bit. Jon Jones and Dana White were at complete odds in 2020. Francis and Jon wanted to fight each other. However, at that time, Francis was not the one being thrown under the bus. It was Jon Jones. Dana White said that Jon Jones was asking for an absurd amount of money. Deontay Wilder money, to be exact. What followed was a public back and forth that got nasty. Keep in mind, in many people's eyes, Jon Jones is the GOAT, the greatest of all time, one of the best talents we've ever seen in the history of our sport. And Dana White having a public, fiery dispute with the greatest of all time is kind of wild when you think about it. Granted, Jon doesn't exactly help himself with all the problems that he gets himself into. Now what followed was just absolute insanity, where Jon Jones claimed he did not ask for Deontay Wilder money, and the Dana White saying that he did have text messages, and Jon Jones did ask for Deontay Wilder money, and then he challenged Jon Jones to a lie detector test. Again, when you go back and read through all of this stuff again, it's just hilarious to read. This right here is the premier MMA organization, ladies and gentlemen. So it carried on with Jon Jones challenging Dana and saying, go ahead, release the text messages. It carried on into the following year, with both sides not budging, and then Jon Jones being arrested for alleged domestic violence. Yeah, we don't need to get into that whole can of worms again. So after a pretty lengthy layoff, Francis rematches Stipe Miocic and beats him quite easily. He becomes the heavyweight champion. Things are looking pretty good because it seemed like everything was okay between Dana and Francis. Things looked good. Francis was the heavyweight champion. He was still calling out Jon. But things got worse again very shortly hereafter. Francis Ngannou was supposed to rematch Derek Lewis, but because he couldn't turn around quite quick enough, the UFC pulled their classic move. When they can't get a champion to turn around quick enough, what do? Set up an interim title. Derek Lewis versus Ciryl Gane for an interim title. Oh boy, let's pause here for a second. This is probably one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen happen in the UFC. Francis claimed he could fight in September, which I haven't seen Dana deny, and Francis's coach shared a text message showing his manager mentioning a September target date. So for the UFC to put an interim title because a champion couldn't turn around in a couple months after winning a title, absolutely baffling. I understand they needed to have a title fight for their card, and I understand the UFC always keeps the ship moving, but this was just absolute BS, completely bizarre. So no surprise, the relationship starts turning sour again at this point. Francis beats Ciryl Gane and unifies the heavyweight title. At this point, the relationship has been up and down for years, and given the interim title fiasco, it's at a new low. Now, what do you guys think Dana White did following this? Do you think he took the chance to make the amends to the relationship, or talk with Francis, or make it better right after the fight? What do you think? I'll give anybody who guesses $1,000 to correct the guess answer. Take a guess. What do you think Dana White did? Dana White, at his all-time pettiness, doesn't come out to even wrap the belt around Francis. Now after this, Dana White did say that there was stuff happening backstage that he had to attend to, which is why he couldn't wrap the belt around Francis and attend the press conference. Obviously, I have no way to confirm or deny this. It just all seems a little bit too convenient. To be fair, he did offer Francis some praise afterwards and said that Francis did have a good game plan, especially when it came to the wrestling. Now, here we are at the beginning of the end. Now, some people might argue that the beginning of the end started in 2018, but for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to say it's right now. We waited a very long year to see what was going to happen next. There was a lot of questions during this time period. I remember we were all very hopeful and excited at a potential Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones matchup. But unfortunately, the UFC and Francis were not able to come to a deal. Dana White announced that Francis is no longer part of the UFC and that the UFC is not going to try to match any offer going forward. Francis did wait for his contract to expire through the sunset clause, which is something that started getting added inside UFC contracts sometime around 2017 from what I've read, likely in response to the current lawsuits the UFC is facing from Kung Lee and Cajun Johnson. Before the sunset clause, the UFC could theoretically tie you up in contracts practically forever if they wanted to. The champions clause would have kicked in, and Francis would have either had to extend his contract for a year or fight 3 fights, whichever came later. Now this exact term has been changed to whichever comes earlier in the mid-2010s. Okay, we made it to the present. What happened after Francis Ngannou's deal was up? First thing we heard was the details regarding the contract the UFC offered to Francis Ngannou. And boy, was it a pretty damn decent contract in general. And a fantastic contract relative to UFC standards. He was offered around $8 million to fight Jon Jones. And it was also reported that he was going to be in a 3-fight contract with no extensions. Francis also wanted to do boxing, but obviously the UFC was not willing to make any guarantees for that. Now, before we continue, when I had heard the news that Francis was offered $8 million to fight Jon Jones and a 3-fight contract with no extension, which they said they were just making an exception just for him, I was pretty shocked that he did not accept that deal. Not only was I shocked, I was also critical towards Francis, and I felt that he made a pretty big mistake. And I'm still going to stand by my statement that relative and compared to other UFC contracts, the $8 million to fight Jon Jones and a 3-fight deal with no extensions is a great deal. Again, relative to UFC standards. So I, along with many others, became critical of Francis. People laughed at Francis, said he was making a huge mistake, and said he would not find a better deal outside of the UFC. One of the other critiques that came along at the time was that there was no guarantee that Francis would land a fight in boxing, which I did agree with at that time. At that time, it seemed far-fetched that a prominent boxer like Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua, or Deontay Wilder would actually sign a deal to fight Francis. Fast forward today, clearly we were all incorrect in our assessment. Months had passed. We were all wondering when Francis would have signed to a deal with another MMA promotion. Now, in the time that was passing, the ridicule against Francis was again increasing. It was an interesting time because it seemed like the people critical about Francis felt more and more vindicated and justified in their beliefs. It also felt like since Francis's decision to leave the UFC, there was 2 separate teams forming. One side defending Francis's decision to leave the UFC on his terms and to stand up for what he believed in, and the other side, which felt like a little bit of a mob in some ways that was critical of Francis. And you know what I kind of realized about this mob? It did feel like at some point they actually started hoping that Francis would fail after the UFC because they were so attached to the idea that what he did was a mistake. It's like politics in some way where one side might be rooting it, cheering, and waiting for the other side to fail or make mistakes so they can feel vindicated and show others that they were right about this person or the person's ideas. So, are we finally at the part in the journey where things went up for Francis? No, not just yet. On March 10th, 2023, Bellator president Scott Coker stated, "My guys have been talking to Francis, but I don't think that there's anything close to a deal being presented back and forth. Let's see what happens." And that he was 50-50 on a potential deal happening. Not a great way to start free agency, and the feeling that he made a mistake started growing larger. On April 4th of 2023, BKFC President David Feldman stated, "We've reached out to him, we've reached to his team, and we just feel like he's asking for unrealistic money, and we're not willing to pay that kind of money for him." Ouch. Another promoter out of the Francis sweepstakes. Next was One Championship. On May 1st of 2023, CEO of One Chaudhry stated that I met with Francis yesterday for almost 3 hours, and that One has decided to withdraw from the process of bidding for Francis Ngannou's services. Okay, this looks like it's heading in a bad direction, right? After One had dropped out of their pursuit of Francis, a large portion of the fanbase shut the book on Francis's future and believed it was case closed for him. Thankfully, thank God, around this time I kept my mouth shut and just decided, let's see what happens. What's funny is in the midst of all this, Ariel Helwani was catching heat from a lot of people. Ariel Helwani had been a huge supporter of Francis since he became a free agent and left the UFC. Ariel was practically delivering State of the Union style addresses for Francis Ngannou whenever he would interview him or talk about him.
Francis Ngannou has hope. Just like he had hope back then as those guards were trying to break him, just like he had hope throughout the entire process as he's crossing over the Black Sea, as he's living in a parking garage, he has hope again.
I'll be honest, sometimes I do feel like Ariel does overdo it when he does stuff like that, but safe to say he was a staunch supporter, and that did land him as a target from some MMA fans who felt he was cheering Francis on and guiding him to poor decisions. Thankfully, the internet provides anonymity. Going back and reading these comments is pretty funny. And again, this is what I was referring to earlier. It felt like there was 2 different sides formed. And at some point, it also felt like people were gleefully jumping anytime news came out that Francis had not signed to a promotion or some sort of failure that he was going through. On a side note, I do want to say I do like Ariel, but there are times when I listen to Ariel talk, it does feel like there's definitely some negative feelings from him towards the UFC when he speaks about the UFC. I mean, the guy's had a rocky relationship with them, so it would make sense he has some ill will towards the top brass at the UFC. After One Championship came out and said they're withdrawing, even though I continued to keep my mouth shut, I also felt pretty doomer towards Francis's future. But out of the ashes, in May of 2023, Francis Ngannou pulled the needle out of the haystack and did what I felt was not possible at the time. This is where large parts of the community were either amazed at what Francis pulled off or were coping hard. Francis Ngannou signed to the PFL. Now, that's not what the big deal is, because the PFL frankly doesn't have much matchups for Francis that I'm interested in. The actual deal and the contract was what I was interested in. Here's a couple things of note. Francis will be competing in the pay-per-view super fight division. The idea in this division is that fighters competing will get 50% of revenues from the pay-per-view, which is obviously a huge thing for MMA fighters. Keep in mind, we don't know how many pay-per-view sales the card Francis will be on will actually pull off. And giving 50% of revenues, while a very pro-fighter move, is still not something I have great confidence in due to PFL's current financials and future. He will also be part of PFL's Global Advisory Board and will serve as chairman for PFL Africa. Another thing which I was just blown away by is that Francis Ngannou's opponents will have a guarantee of $2 million to fight him. Wow. Now, ultimately, we'll have to see what he gets paid for his first fight in the PFL, because that's obviously something I'm very curious about. The big question is it going to match the $8 million from the UFC? But you know what? Even if it doesn't match that $8 million, I'm here to tell you it does not matter, because what got announced on July 2023 makes Francis Ngannou's entire gamble potentially worth it. Ladies and gentlemen, he did it. Francis Ngannou versus Tyson Fury. On July of 2023, it was announced that Francis Ngannou would compete against Tyson Fury on October 28th in Saudi Arabia. As of recording this video, this fight has not happened yet, and hopefully it does happen. This was a huge reason for Francis leaving the UFC. A boxing fight is something Francis always wanted, and he got it. And here's the thing, this fight is not with just some random boxer, some random bum, some random no-name. He is fighting arguably the best heavyweight fighter alive currently. So here we are today, close to fight day, close to Fury versus Ngannou. I know that boxing fans aren't exactly happy about this fight. They would rather see Fury fight Usyk. Believe me, I really want to see Fury versus Usyk as well, and I hope it happens soon. Will Francis win? Definitely not, unless he somehow catches Fury with the perfect punch and KOs him. But regardless if he loses, he's already won. He silenced the doubters, inspired his followers, and he's going to be leaving a permanent legacy behind in his own way. Enjoy the payday, Francis, and enjoy being on the high horse right now. It's well deserved.